due to their critical methodologies. So we know that this is not a new debate in academia. We unfortunately witnessed the closing down of gender studies programs not long ago in Hungary by the right-wing government, which was a major infringement on academic freedom and university autonomy. Yet another attack on academic freedom is taking place in Turkey at Boğaziçi University, which Lorena shared in her welcoming talk. And this time the attack is not only towards the academics who are the advocates of critical thinking, but also towards their students who have been taken into custody, placed under house arrest, faced violence for using their right to peaceful protest, and also the closing down of the LGBTI+ student club in the university. So here we can go back to yesterday's discussions, which opened up the debates on how the current role of rising authoritarianism across the world impacts our research and forces us to find creative means of new methodological tools and open up new conversations, which would bring us to the second point of our discussion of the 2 days. Today in the afternoon, Professor Carina Listenborn underlined critical scholars' timely discussion on the changing politics and social science in general. However, she directed us to our second point to focus on the politics of methodology and methods, particularly from a perspective of decolonizing methodologies. She posed the question of, why do we do research? Is it to get academic points or to change society? So this is a challenging task for sure. But Carina opened the way to answer this question by taking our interest in the feminist methodology, one of the scholarships tackling these debates on why and how we are doing research. What is the power of language in our research? Thus, decolonizing our way of doing research is not to erase our perspectives, rather centering the indigenous concerns into them. So the solution is not about copy and paste perspectives, but finding similar patterns in different settings and contexts with a particular variation. The discussion venues of today, which Lorena will share with you in a minute, also carried the engagement of yesterday's interventions by our discussants. Just to remember what they brought on our table yesterday was first Professor Tribina's intervention on how dislocating urban studies echoes as a disruption in coherent scientific and political narratives, which produces nuances and irritation among knowledge producers. So we need to think of the act of dislocating together with dislocated geographies and their uses. This brings us to Professor Robinson's question of, so what the urban is then? We need to start with this question to reformat how we define comparison and comparative urban studies, which we discussed a lot today in the morning. So Lorena will highlight the main discussions of today now. Lorena?
Our first presenter today, Baha, kicks off discussing the gentrification, social reproduction nexus from an intersectional perspective. At the basis of her argument is how gentrification and displacement are social and spatial manifestations of social reproduction. Looking at the Talabasi area, she argues that the dispossession gentrification nexus in the region has meant the increased burden of emotional and material labor for women. She reflects how displacement becomes a tool to displace the crisis of social reproduction of the working class to other geographies, while allowing the social reproduction of the middle classes. She invites us to discuss the different geographies of dispossession through a feminist ethnography perspective, suggesting the power of urban and feminist studies to understand the everyday gender dispossession. As a response to her work, Professor Söderström highlighted the importance of different scales in the process, given the current context of Erdogan's own politics in the country. By pointing to the uncomfortable position of challenging the power structures in Turkish society, he highlights that understanding a masculine revanchism in the context of Talabasi may be a powerful motivation to understand processes of gender dispossession in other geographies as well. Following, Frances starts her presentation with an important provocation, but how do we do comparison? And even further, how do we position ourselves as a comparative scholar, especially navigating through the intricate processes of recognition, publication, and research agendas? Looking at real estate role in both Johannesburg and London, she highlighted the positive aspects to assume cognitive dissonance to navigate different realities through more familiar tools. Tracing for comparison is very important. How do cities, peoples, artifacts, and things are connected, and what the hidden circulations? Professor Söderström, in response to her contribution, proposes that what Lefebvre calls transductive research. By having a hunch of what we want to compare, we work with the virtualities of what things have become or might have become. Francis brings the often feared second reviewer, who in her case saw no validity in looking at Johannesburg, suggesting to stick to London since everyone wants to know about London. As painful as it is, her intervention pinpoints how we have a long way to go until we don't have to convince our scholarly field that it is relevant to see cities such as Johannesburg beyond the framework of the exotic. Our third contribution, Carola, looks at possible toolboxes to discuss housing policy mobility. She departs from the very reality of governments, drawing on best cases to develop local approaches to housing. She highlights the importance to look at such flows from a research object that's immobile and always manifest in space. The inertia of its materiality is met with the mobility of policies, local practices which also mobilize fixed aspects from elsewhere. That requires both a nuanced understanding of knowledge and which knowledge is valid and valued, but also the idea of translation, both of terms of places, contexts, and from abstract to concrete. Professor Soderstrom then suggests that actor network perspective may provide a more encompassing framework to understand the networks that are formed by intermediates and intermediations along the way. To conclude her contribution, she highlights that a comparative framework explores the notion of learning from other places and may be a way to discuss whether explicit learning is actually used as a mechanism of marketing and superficial referencing. Our last presenter, Michael, looks at the relational comparative approach to discuss Beirut and Dublin from a relational perspective. He brings again a discussion around scales of analysis by arguing that relational perspective is a way to problematize the claims to globalness, thus thinking about the relation between the global and the regional. He takes us into a relational journey of the two cities by presenting how them through such urban relationality framework. He asks, how do we carry out comparison and what are the frameworks that may be mobilized to do so? Indeed, as Professor Soderstrom highlighted in all his contributions, comparison is not an easy deed and is often open for scrutiny of the so-feared second reviewer. A relational approach needs to do just more than encompassing and universalizing comparison. What are the mechanisms of a relational urbanization in Beirut and Dublin? In the afternoon, we first went to Latin America with Dalia and Francesca. Dalia focused on temporary uses of vacant and underused land in Latin America as space for social and collective action. Throughout her presentation, she discusses the nature of the research in an online arena. She walks us through its dynamic step-by-step dynamics. Dalia argues that it is important to understand the interrelation between actors, processes, and sites, and the context of the sites, as well as the meaning of such appropriations from a local perspective. Professor Listerborn highlighted that Dalia's presentation and work is a positive contribution to the field, since methodological work often reads on how research should be done, but little is offered around processes of finding oneself throughout it. Rightly so, Dalia expands the inductive nature of her research to us and the use of narrative inquiry as a method. Our second presenter, Francesca, looks at Latin America again, but from another lens. She delves into the geopolitics of knowledge production from the perspective of spatial governance and planning systems. She proposes we understand the ways planning manages the multiple complexes processes of vertical and horizontal interactions. But as she reminds us, such processes have historically been taken from an Europeanized perspective, often facilitated by the grounds of internationalization of the planning field, leaving the question of how relevant spatial planning is. And even more, as Professor Listerborn highlights, what is planning in itself? She reminds us that planning needs to be understood in relation to the power regimes at place. While it may be used as control, it may also be a way to redistribute. To that, Francesca reflects on how being a planner of the North, planning in the South, means often mobilizing circulating models from other parts of the world, overlooking local practices. Power relations inform best practices, even when policies circulate from South to North. So drawing from her own practice, she draws on the decolonial turn to challenge the politics of knowledge production that still shape the field. After the break, Apan and Karen took us to Philadelphia to discuss how visual methods may help us understand the urban social injustices at the urban margins. Also using a feminist intersectional framework, they argue for a politics of visuality, and as Professor Listerborn highlights, the politics of methodology and critical teaching. The authors ask, how do we see and are made able to see? if and how they are subverted by the communities. They delved into the everyday of the marginalized, investigating with a group of students how mundane objects may manifest structural inequities. Furthermore, they argue that looking through racialized systems, it is possible to identify subversive and joyful moments of belonging. They argue that visual methods may be an entry point to understand broader spatial and temporal patterns. Through different anecdotes taken from the students' work, they use visual as an entry point and a means to rethink justice and systemic change. They discuss how uneven visibility of those occupying spaces, the materiality of presence and the absence are important measures of the power relations that help shape space and spatial injustices. Zlem, now with you.
Yeah, thank you. Before moving to the details of the next workshop, we want to make a last point, especially for the early career researchers who are affected the most by the pandemic. What was coming to front during the 2 days conversations was how we will approach the impact of COVID-19 in our experience of doing research. There were calls for new strategies to adapt ourselves in the changing conditions, but this can be draining for many of us. But what we would like to conclude with is to put some hopeful notes to overcome the challenges that COVID-19 brings to researchers. As today, Dalia, Aparna, and Karen argued, having to reshift the fieldwork also opens up the other forms of research methods, or as Bahar called it in her presentation today this morning, using this time to digest what we gathered so far can be the silver lining. And even maybe we can also see COVID-19-led slow research approach, not as a limitation, but as a possibility to develop ideas on alternative research methods for future. So on that hopeful note, I will briefly share the details of the next workshop. The last but not the least of our workshops in this series will take place on the 17th and 18th May. In the last workshop, we will be revisiting the concepts of critical urban studies like neoliberal urbanism, financialization, and gentrification to produce a critique of urban studies scholarship, which has been saturated by empirical studies, reusing already existing concepts, while ignoring the dialectical relationship between concrete and the abstract theorizations. We will be searching responses to the questions of in what ways is it possible to call back dialectics to revisit existing concepts in urban studies? How can we rework popular concepts while keeping the wider theoretical web in which they're embedded inside? And how can we go beyond using mainstream concepts as a part of variegated forms in different geographies? So we will have 8 papers for each day. We are also happy to host our discussants, Matthias Bend, Thomas Molutas, Miguel Martinez, and Monica Strolle. And please get registered for the next workshop if you're interested, and visit our blog for updates and new blog posts in the meantime, and see you next month.